Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Student Success, the class on taking responsibility and legacy. So just wanted to launch right in here for you guys with a question, something that might be of interest for you guys to think about and for you guys to pay attention to as you move forward in your lives and the next steps in your academic career as you watch and take in the media. It's this question that I think might help you understand the framework of the entire point of this particular class. And it's, how do you think that culture views responsibility? I think that begs a very important question in our particular class here on student success, and I think that it will help shape us and guide us and move us forward into the future in a few ways that maybe we're not perhaps expecting. So how do you think our culture views responsibility? And so maybe a good follow-up prompt that I've asked in past classes when I'm trying to kind of get at the heart of this issue is, how many of you guys who have just come out of high school have been said that, you were at, this is what the question that got asked of me when I was actually at my, or just kind of the thing that got thrown out while I was at my, my graduation party from high school. And they said something to the effect of, high school is high school and college is the best time of your life. Really take advantage of it because college is the best time of your life, or high school was the best time that you were going to have. And it's all uphill from here. It's going to be tough, and I think that realistically, the heart behind that question, although it seems like a kind of a casual joke and, something that, we don't pay a lot of attention to, is it gets to the root of something deeper, in my opinion. And that's how our culture views responsibility as a whole. And I would submit to you that most of our culture's kind of portrayal of responsibility is negative. And that when somebody is telling you that the college is going to be the best time of your life, what they're saying is this is the time in your life where you have the most freedom and the least responsibility. And the reality is that's what they tell you is the best time. And what it's doing is the question is reframing you to think that the best time in your life is when you have the least amount of responsibility and the most amount of freedom, right? And so I've seen so many people kind of chasing that idea throughout their life, that I want to have the most amount of freedom and the most amount of fun for the least amount of responsibility, and that's the trade-off. And what I would submit to you is that chasing that particular brand of quote-unquote happiness, or whatever you want to term it, is not going to lead you a whole lot of good places. And so what I think is interesting is, as we kind of evaluate this, to think about, okay, well, what is the role of responsibility in my life? And, should I see more responsibility as a burden? Or should I see it as something that's necessary? And how do I deal with that? And I think that we look at that in many areas of our life, right? That you finish up college and you get a job and you go, I'm stuck to a desk for 30 years of my life until I retire. Or, I'm going to get married. And a lot of people make jokes that, the stupid joke is when you get married that your life's over. And why is that? Because people are saying, well, when you're single, you have the most amount of freedom and the least amount of responsibility. And so that we're, again, conditioning ourselves to believe that the best things in life are what is the most amount of freedom for the least amount of responsibility. And that's what we've been taught. And that's what our culture pushes. And that's what our culture often defines as happiness. And so what I think is interesting is, as we look at this, it's just that this idea of responsibility should not be that responsibility is to be avoided at all costs, but that responsibility, I would submit to you today, is something that will actually ground you, and it will shape you. It will make you the best follower of Christ that you can be, and it will be something that gives you an overarching level of meaning to your life. that if you want to have the most fruitful life, you want to have the most Christ-filled life, if you want to have the most, I would say, adventurous and difficult yet fulfilling life, that you need to take on as much responsibility as you're able to. And I think it's an interesting correlation because this isn't what we're taught. And so we as Christians, I think, should be teaching this idea of responsibility. And perhaps you saw that in the videos, as we go through this. But one of the things that I think is interesting about this kind of a correlation, and something that I think might help us understand really the proper place for responsibility, and as we said, a responsibility and legacy is the title, and I think those things are very intermingled. If you want to have the greatest legacy possible, right, that there are some interesting kind of correlations in your life. And so I kind of want to go through this, and that's something that I get often in this class. I apologize, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think responsibility, the long story short, is that I think responsibility correlates to two major hot button issues in our culture that we're not addressing. And that's two things: anxiety and depression. Right? We hear so much about anxiety and depression in our current culture. And just a quick disclaimer, I absolutely do believe that there is real anxiety and that there's real depression, that you can have, a chemical imbalance or some sort of a health situation that is causing anxiety and depression. So I don't want this to by any means demean somebody who might be going through that. But what I think is interesting is that specifically with both of these two things, that we really don't look at a lot of root causes for those things in our culture. We're not asked proper questions. And I'll give you an example specifically with anxiety, and then I'll go into depression. But anxiety specifically, I interacted very closely with a gal. I actually worked with her at one particular time, and she mentioned at one point to me that she was going to, she said casually, "Oh, I'm going to go to my doctor. I'm going to get on some anxiety medication." And she mentioned this like it was very casual, and, it was just the most natural thing in the world. And I had we were pretty close, and so I asked her some pretty honest questions about her life. And, one of the things that I found out about her is that she took on a new job that was very, it was different than what she had experienced in the past, in that it required a lot of her, that it required a lot of effort and time and energy and thought. It wasn't just a job that she could just go in, do her job, sit down, punch a clock, and punch out. It was something that really required her to have a good amount of problem solving, a good amount of drive, something that really pushed her. And then I also found out through that conversation with her that she had a son who was autistic and was keeping her up, or was getting her up at 3 a.m. every morning, and that he was up till 3 a.m. and only would go to bed at 9 o'clock at night, would only sleep 6 hours, and that she was having trouble adjusting to that particular schedule. In addition to that, the father of her autistic son was just getting out of prison. He was a meth addict, and that she was worried that he was going to make an appearance in her life again. Her parents were considering a divorce. There was just a lot of extenuating circumstances that she was going through in her life. And what was interesting to me was that her natural reaction was not to try to work through some of those anxieties that she had by solving them and saying, okay, how can I be the most effective at my job? Is there anything that I can do for my son so that he sleeps better? Is there any way that I can try to not be in the middle of my parents' potential divorce? Is there anything that I can do with the court system to manage the situation with my ex so that he's not showing up in my life or creating an issue for my son? Anything like that. The first response of hers was to go get pills. That was just it. I'm just going to go get pills and that'll help. Right? And my thought on this is just, okay, well, you should be anxious about those things. And might I suggest that from talking with her, one of her main anxieties was her job. And the reason why the job was so anxiety provoking for her was because she had never had a job that she actually had to try. Never had a job where she actually had to push herself. And what's interesting is I noticed that in many cases, right, that I talk to folks who are having a high amount of anxiety, and it directly correlates with them being in a new situation, and one that particularly has to do with them pushing themselves. And what I find interesting about that is that's the whole point of an anxiety response for your body, is that it's going through something new, and new things are stressful, and that your body is trying to accommodate for all this newness and difficulty and you pushing yourself. And what I notice about our current culture is that as we get farther and farther away from responsibility, it seems like our level of anxiety is going up. And might I submit to you, and not all the cases, but in many cases, I think that the reason why this is going on is because we are trying as hard as we can to get away from responsibility. And then when we have something that truly pushes us and stretches us, that we have never, I shouldn't say never, but we've had very few circumstances in which we have actually experienced that. And so when our natural response, and I would say a right response, is for us to get really anxious. And I look at the times in my own particular life that I've been the most anxious, and I have been the most anxious about a new and difficult circumstances that really stretched me and pulled me outside of my comfort zone. And that by, raising our youth to avoid responsibility, what we're doing is by, just by virtue of the fact that you're going to have to take on responsibility at some point, that when they do take on that responsibility, that their level of anxiety shoots through the roof because they haven't actually done things that are difficult in their life, and they've been shielded from those difficult things. And what I think is interesting about that particular topic is that Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about that in his video. He talks about the overprotective mother, and that what the overprotective mother is doing isn't actually helping their child by being overprotective. It's that they're actually hurting them in the long term. And what I think is interesting is he says something that's very important, and I think it's something that we should pay attention to tonight. It's that he says something like the reason why you allow your children to go through difficult things is so that they can encounter any number of difficult things. That we purposely create a difficult circumstances for our children so that they will learn to cope and to deal with difficulty, to deal with responsibility, so that they can actually be successful when the parents aren't able to help them through that. That you create a safe environment to say, okay, now I'm your parent, I'm going to let you go through this difficult thing, or this anxiety-provoking thing, or take on this measure of responsibility while I'm here, so that if you get into real trouble that I can help you, but that while you're doing that and struggling with it, that you get accustomed to going through and dealing with difficult things. The second thing that I notice is our depression, and I'll use another example from another person in my life. And she was going through a situation where she was talking with me and said, I think I'm going to go again. I'm going to go to my doctor and I'm going to get antidepressants. And I said, well, hold on. Well, let's have a conversation about this. I felt like I had the ability to have this conversation with her at that time. And I said, so talk to me about this. What's going on in your life? Well, I come to find out she had moved, gotten a new job that was very difficult, that was very tough on her, that it was not in a good environment. It wasn't that it was stretching her. It was to the point where it was an unhealthy work environment. She had just found out actually that I think she was 24 or 25 at the time, that she actually had two siblings that she had never known about. She found out that this because she got a call from law enforcement that said her dad, who she had very little contact with over her life, was a heroin addict and was actually being thrown in jail for dealing heroin. And that she needed to, and they were asking her if she would take her younger brother and younger sister, right? This huge amount of weight just dropped on her. And on top of all of those things, she had found out that her stepdad, who had been like her father growing up, actually was diagnosed with stage 4 terminal brain cancer. And then they were coping with a situation where he wasn't going to be with them for much longer. And my response in this particular case is not, again, I do believe that depression is legitimate, but in my response to that, it's, you don't need pills. you need to get through this. It's not that she's suicidal or she wasn't suicidal or thinking, having these thoughts and these plans or anything like that. It was just that she was legitimately just going through a really difficult time. And rather than trying to feel that and deal with it as best she could, she was trying to hide by going to a doctor and asking for pills for antidepressants. And so what I think is interesting in a lot of these cases is that, your anxiety, your depression are oftentimes linked to these things that we go, oh, it's just something where I need some pills. And in reality, we need to actually deal with a lot of these circumstances that we're going through, right? And that, what's interesting to me as the correlation between depression and what we're talking about in responsibility is that if you actually go and and depression in many cases, as I've seen it manifested in people that I know and people that I've talked to, is this kind of this feeling of hopelessness and that my life really doesn't have any meaning, and that, I'm really not making any kind of an impact, and that, and that's just some of the things that I hear. It's not all of it certainly, but that seems to be a very common theme, is just I don't feel like I have any meaning in my life. And oftentimes that leads them down a road of very difficult, things of like, well, maybe I should consider suicide or, something absolutely horrific. And the reality that I notice is, and as it correlates to responsibility, and what's interesting is that those with the lowest amount of like on a suicide prevention website, out of 5 factors that they list as not risk factors that usually are correlated against depression and suicide, 3 of the things that they tell you and they recommend to you as somebody who's depressed are directly correlated with responsibility and how much responsibility you have in your life and are taking on. And so essentially what they're saying in many of these cases is that if you want to be less depressed, if you want to feel like you have meaning and you have value, that what's correlated with those 2 things of meaning and value are often things that are responsibilities, right? That the folks who are statistically the least likely to actually commit suicide are people with the most amount of responsibility. And I found that interesting and absolutely just kind of it's a thought-provoking argument that if you want to have the most meaning in your life, and what the data seems to indicate in that particular data set seems to suggest, is that the more responsibility you take on, the less likely you are to be depressed, and the less likely you are to commit suicide, and the more likely you are to feel like your life has meaning and invaluable purpose. And what I would like to tell you guys today is that if you're ever looking at anxiety or depression, that, look at your life and evaluate how much responsibility you've taken on. And you say, okay, can I take on some sort of responsibility in the case of depression that will make me feel like I have meaning? Is there anything, I hear this a lot, and this is a very sad and horrible situation, but you kind of have to be a little bit brutally honest in this, and I apologize if it comes off wrong, but people will say, well, my life really doesn't have any meaning, and I don't know if anybody would really miss me if I was gone. And the reality is, it's like, well, what in your life would make what does your life contain that would that is having an impact on another person, right? And usually, if you don't have any impact on other people, you feel hopeless, and the way that you have impact on others is by taking on responsibility. That the more responsibility you take on in your life, that the more you have an impact on people, the more that you feel like your life has meaning and value. And I would submit to you guys tonight and encourage you in is that don't subscribe to this idea that the culture is coming out with that says, oh, have the most amount of freedom and the least amount of responsibility, but that if you want to have the most meaningful life, that the most meaningful life is found from you taking as much responsibility as possible, and you bearing that responsibility well and stewarding that responsibility well, right? That if you want to have an impact on people, so kids are obviously a huge responsibility. And as I'm, have a 3-month-old myself, I can tell you, that you do feel the weight of that. But what's interesting is it's also correlated with just this incredible sense in my life of purpose and of meaning, that like my life has a direct impact on this little human being that I'm responsible for raising, right? That's an incredible purpose to live for, to be able to do that. And yes, it's absolutely to some degree a burden in the sense of it's difficult, but freeing and also rewarding in the sense of the fact that that burden is worth being carried, and that I have the opportunity to be able to really truly have an impact on somebody else's life, that this little person, that I can have that I can turn her into a functioning and excellent member of society, that I can teach her about Christ and his sacrifice for her life, and that I can teach her things and allow her to grow and mature. And it's an amazing feeling. And I would say that in many cases, and in many of the things in my own current life, it's like I have those responsibilities, and those are the things that give my life the most meaning and the most purpose and the most fulfillment. And so what I would submit to you guys is just go out of your way to put that responsibility onto your shoulders and bear it in the best way that you can. And I would again submit to you that the way that when you do that oftentimes the negative consequences that we so often see in our culture, like anxiety or depression, oftentimes will go down and lessen the more responsibility you take. So that's my my kind of spiel for tonight, my class, my encouragement, hopefully. Again, y'all have an assignment due this Saturday. There is a discussion that's already posted. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Talk to you later, guys.